Hello there, friends. I absolutely loved this conversation. So, I am a giant Hamilton fan. And when I booked my next guest, Stephen Clouse, I had no idea that we would end up pretty much talking about Hamilton for the entire conversation. So, what Stephen really brings up through the story of Hamilton is we're looking at what's going on right now, but he describes it as the early American ideals are being tested right now. So, liberty versus license. And the story of Hamilton is it's a tragedy about a young person who is ambitious. And the ambition that he embodies is his salvation as well as his downfall. And so we go through what that story sort of has to do with what's going on now. We look at the private versus the public sectors and how social media, especially Twitter, with regards to, say, Twitter mobs and whatnot, how these things are very mixed. They're sort of a bit of a Venn diagram. They're not a clean line of the private life versus the public sector. We go through a lot of other things too, but it is a really cool talk. And I hope that you guys like it. And leave me a comment, ask Stephen a question, subscribe if you haven't, and yeah, let me know what you guys think. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing just fine.
So we have been just discussing how great it's been for you to be off of social media and how productive you have been.
Yeah. Yes, on both fronts. Yes, I've been productive, and it is nice to not feel like you're being pulled in 1,000 different directions every 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so anybody that's listening and thinking, "Boy, this is bad for me," it probably is. Detox for a couple weeks.
Make some changes. Why didn't you come back? You thought you might come back. I remember that, actually.
Yeah, I'm still planning to come back on at some point here in short order, probably in the next few weeks. Well, maybe in a couple months. I don't know. It's been really nice not being on and fighting. I have my Facebook that I still will sometimes, but that's family people wanting to yell at each other. So there's But otherwise, yeah, it's been nice. I will say my Twitter experience is weird from most people. I had sort of developed a network of people that I liked.
No, I do that too. Like I love it though.
Like like a hellhole where everybody's just screaming at you all the time. So I do miss that. I miss that part of it. But all the fake outrage or finding something to be outraged about every day, I don't need that.
You're like, that's been rewarding not having that. Yeah. Moving into the main event here, sir. So we last spoke about virtue and what it means to be a citizen in a liberal society, and do we need narratives for that, et cetera, et cetera. If people want to, they can check it out. I'll put the last chat we had in the description here. But so now our sort of social atmosphere has somewhat altered since we spoke with regards to COVID and then the murder of George Floyd and all that has ensued as a result. And so I wanted to talk with you about what do the ancients and the founding fathers era type of wisdom, because I know that's your specialty. Those spaces. I want to know what sort of answers they have, or at least suggestions of things to ponder. So that's kind of where I wanted to start.
Okay, well that's a heck of a launching point. So I think I will tackle it in the reverse order that you suggested.
Okay.
I'll turn to the American founding first, and then we'll go back and look at some of in the ancient world. My specialty is in Aristotle, so I'll probably talk about him the most.
Okay.
But so in the founding period, I hope everybody, if you have had a chance on your Disney Plus accounts, if you have one, that you've watched Hamilton and experienced that.
Yes.
Because I think I'm going to
Yes.
use that as a way of talking about some of the stuff here.
Okay. I'm so pumped
Um,
that you are. Like, I'm a huge fan. So I'm sorry I had to
yeah,
fangirl out just for a second. Yes, absolutely. Yes, please do.
yeah. Oh, it's terrific. So the thing that's the most interesting, sort of watching the cast. I've been listening to the thing for years now, but I'm not one of the lucky 1,000 people that ever got to go see it like live or whatever.
Yeah.
But getting to sort of watch it as a theatrical experience, it's a nice reminder of how important storytelling is for people, and to have shared stories about who we are, who we sort of aspire to be, both within a country and then sort of beyond it. Obviously, Hamilton has appeals well beyond the American context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways that's because it's talking to sort of a liberal character in the sort of the classical sense, the way that we've used that, which I think that's now floats around in social media in a way that people kind of get the difference between like an American liberal and a classic liberal. If not, I'm going to use it in the classical sense, meaning someone like John Locke or John Stuart Mill. Alexander Hamilton is a classical liberal in both economic and political terms. What I find so interesting about that story and the play itself isn't isn't the way that it tells us actually about Hamilton. It's not accurate history, but it shouldn't be. And there's a lot of discussion about that in terms of representation in art and representation in theater, and people get very excited about this. Hamilton certainly is tackling that through who is playing what characters and what the characters look like.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them people of color. Obviously, the people they are presenting, the historical figures, weren't.
Mm-hmm.
But frequently, what gets lost in these conversations, or where you focus too much on questions of representation, it sort of misses the point of the plot, which is the whole reason of watching a story, is to develop through it. Yeah, the character is important, but you could just have a person stand and give you a soliloquy as a character. That's not interesting.
Mm.
What's interesting, what are they doing? And so what I find so compelling about the Hamilton musical is it's a warning about ambition, I think, more than anything else.
Okay.
This is a man who, right out of the gate in the introduction monologue, how does this, this bastard who's the son of a whore that's poor go on to become this incredibly powerful thing?
Yeah, yeah.
And then it destroys him. He, not to, I guess I give spoiler alerts for something.
Yeah, like, no, I know, but it actually is totally true. But spoilers, go watch it if you don't want to hear. But please do the spoilers. We need to know.
Yeah. So I'll do the spoiler, but like when the affair with Reynolds,
With Mariah Reynolds, yeah.
Yeah, when he has an affair with her, and then has the embezzlement accusations and the rest. All of these are part of his character. Like, it's not a surprise that this happens to him. When you get to that point, you're disappointed, right? You're like, how can you do this? How stupid can you be? But I don't find it surprising.
But why?
Huh?
Why don't you find it surprising?
Why don't I find it surprising? Because the same thing that drove him to sort of his vainglory in the Revolution, that constant need to prove his name to gain honor, and in some ways that makes him a very sort of classical hero, a classic, like, tragic hero. And I think that's why the Hamilton is so compelling, especially in American media, but I think sort of broadly, since American media has sort of saturated everything for a couple of decades now, people don't like tragedies. And I don't mean sad stories. I mean stories that are about the undoing of a person because of a choice that they've made that comes from their character.
Okay.
And I think by the time you get to Hamilton's end with the duel with Burr, I think the reason that story is so compelling, it's not a surprise.
Right.
These are choices that have been made, and he's doing it because of his ambition. And Burr, throughout the entire play, starts with very little ambition, grows more and more, and what does it cost him? His entire reputation. He kills Alexander Hamilton. Spoiler: kills Alexander Hamilton and
Well, I mean, the opening song, "I'm the damn fool that shot him." Like, come on.
right.
Like, yeah.
Well, and even before that, I mean, he shot him in 1803. It's he's been dead for a while.
You're like, I mean, like, also before the opening of the curtain of Hamilton, yeah, like a couple, like 100 years ago, yeah.
Right. So the way that the story is set up, yes, it has all these questions of representation, and when you listen to the cast talk about this, that's very important to the cast. It's very important to people who are engaged in art now. And I think I'm going to stay silent on that for a little while.
Okay.
But in terms of the plot structure, I'm a little bit more comfortable talking about that. People they don't tend to like to talk about plot too much. Even in sort of modern art criticism, there's a reticence to get too much into it. Part of this actually comes from what I have studied. This is what my dissertation has been on, is on the primacy of plot and its importance in Aristotelian aesthetics.
Okay.
And the reason that a plot is so important, at least for Aristotle, and I think I'm persuaded by this, is it's intelligible. When you get to the end, you understand why it's the end because you have a strong beginning and middle, and they're all connected to the same theme or structure. You don't get it was one of my favorite things in the poetics. These stories can't be so long that you can't remember how the beginning happened when you get to the end.
Yes.
This is sort of one of his criticisms of Homer. It's too damn long. I can't remember when we get to the end.
Yeah.
And I think sort of modern movies tell us about the length of what we can pay, and the ancient stories were about the same length. Hamilton is so interesting because it's constantly reminding you, in the way the music is written, but also lyrically, everything is sort of through composed. You can't ever forget what the plot is. It's constantly reminding you.
Right.
Because of, I think, the tragic nature of this character. But the other part that I find interesting about this is Christopher Hitchens, but before he passed, that was almost 10 years ago, he talked about, and I'm convinced of this too, that when you talk about America, you can't ever get too far without talking about Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
And somehow those two things are connected. I think Jefferson knew that. John Adams certainly did. It agitated the crap out of him because Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, or at least the first draft. What this story does is it recenters, the Hamilton story, recenters the American story away from the, let's call him, difficult character of Thomas Jefferson to the somewhat more palatable to a contemporary audience of Alexander Hamilton. It's in a certain sense trying to rewrite the story of the American identity. But it's a warning. It's a tragedy. Right?
Because okay, I'm sorry. I'm like with you here, but like enthusiastically so. So yeah.
Yeah. So when Hamilton is sort of undone, there's a lot of questions about legacy and who gets to tell the story that's the ending song, incredibly moving ending.
Yeah.
And sort of what's the burden on this kind of stuff. But the sort of the broader, bigger question that I'm left with when I finish the musical, the play, what are we supposed to be as a sort of a character if Hamilton is paralleled with the nation, which he is in the musical over and over and over. What's the great warning to America? Don't have too much ambition, because it will be your undoing. In a certain sense, it's very culturally progressive, Hamilton is, but it's a very conservative story. In the sense of don't have too much ambition, don't try to overdo this stuff.
Don't fly too close to the sun. They literally have an Icarus line in there. Yes.
That's right. But what's interesting is the way that has sort of disseminated out, or what I've seen of it anyway, disseminated out. That's not the part that's being talked about, particularly in light of the current events that are going on, domestically here in the States and then also globally. Relative to George Floyd and these questions of police brutality and white supremacy and racism and these things. There's a lot of conversation about having a revolution, and I don't think they're taking that seriously. I think it's a metaphorical one, because I can't imagine anybody's going to be willing to, as they say at the end of the Declaration of Independence, to sacrifice their lives, their their honor and their fortunes and their sacred honor. Excuse me. I just don't think people are going to be willing to put all that on the line.
Okay.
Maybe I'll be wrong, but
well, let's see.
Let's
see November 2020 through.
Yeah, we'll see.
Sorry, I totally segued over there. That's what I'm.
No.
That event is what I'm worried that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be curious. The U.S. has had tumultuous elections before.
In 2016.
Sure.
But yes, but I guess it's a long history of elections. So yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the one thing that Americans should take pride in, if nothing else. We've never missed one. And we've always had the peaceful transition of power in every election, and it's sort of built into the expectation. It's remarkable that we, and then through the extension, sort of the rest of the Western liberal world, sort of just have this expectation that that's just how this stuff goes.
Right.
That's good. I don't know why people would want to overturn that. It's good that people sort of we would be appalled if it didn't go that way.
Right.
And that's good. That takes a long time to cultivate that. That is not a natural condition.
Well, I derailed you over. Sorry, I brought up the elections, but you were saying about you don't think people will be willing to give up.
I think part of it is the sort of the cultural. I find this is what's interesting, I suppose, and this is the only thing that really wants to make me to come back on social media is the social scientist in me wants to sort of watch everybody because it's a perfect sort of glass house. The way that there's the cultural reception, and then there's sort of the nuts and bolts sort of what the story beats element that sort of the phenomenon that's going around Hamilton wants to be this sort of inspirational character. You can change the world and this kind of stuff. Yeah, but there's a second half to the play, guys. Like once we get past the writing of the Federalist Papers, and he goes into the Treasury and all the rest of it, his whole life gets unspooled, and it's because of his deep ambition.
Yes.
And the error in thinking that he could be a gentleman, fighting against, shooting in these duels against Aaron Burr, presuming Burr would do the same thing, and it could have really been that Aaron Burr was such a bad shot that he was trying to miss Hamilton and killed him accidentally.
Is that what some say?
Oh yeah. There's certainly some of that there's conversations about that.
Okay.
But the real sort of the takeaway from that story is don't duel with people. You certainly can't get shot.
Yes.
But what I find interesting about it, again, sort of taking the story as a way of cultivating identity, especially when we're talking Hamilton versus Jefferson, is America as sort of an idea, as a character, is really, and I'm borrowing from the French political scientist, sociologist, proto-sociologist, Alexis de Tocqueville, where he really sort of parallels America and democracy together. As goes America, so goes democracy, at least in the 19th century when he's writing. And he's really talking about liberalism too. He doesn't really talk about it directly in his book, but he sort of mixes them together. Democracy and liberalism in America, they're sort of fused. And they kind of are in our modern minds too.
Can you give a quick definition of liberalism? Just so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, thanks. I certainly will. Liberalism means belief in the primacy of the individual over the collective or the state, a respect for individual rights, the importance of private property, these kinds of things. That's fundamentally the central tenets of liberalism. The word itself means it's a thinking about freedom. To be liberal means to be free. So that's what it's really concerned with. It's the ism of freedom. And the school that sort of comes from it through the British tradition, going back in some ways to Hobbes and John Locke and John Stuart Mill. Mill is really the important one in some ways for our concerns today. How do you maximize individual liberty and individual happiness? how do they understand happiness? These are a lot. I mean, we could talk about this for the next 3 or 4 hours.
All right, yeah, yes,
I
okay.
teach semester-long things on these questions. They're good.
Right.
They're good questions. There's just a lot of.
But just, yes, for our quick purposes
But
of,
for our
that's what
purposes,
liberalism means, yes.
For our purposes, I think liberalism can really be boiled down probably to three things: the individual over the collective, the importance, or government is created by the consent of the governed for the protection of their rights,
Yeah.
and the importance, the centrality of private property, both in your person and in your stuff.
Okay.
And that's really sort of the core tenets of liberalism.
Okay.
And so then doubling back on the Tocqueville thing, and then to apply it here to the Hamilton question, is if Hamilton is a liberal, and he is in that sense, he absolutely is. His writings make that very clear. The character in the play makes that very clear.
Okay.
It corresponds to this ambition that this young man has. I mean, Hamilton dies in his like mid-40s.
Yeah.
Very young. But he climbs very rapidly through military structure and then goes into politics, and he's very, very prominent. But he's undone by the thing that makes him great.
Yes.
St. Augustine says the same thing of the Roman Empire. What's the thing that destroys the Roman Empire? People were accusing Christianity, and he says, no. It's the empire. It's the imperial aspiration. It's the military virtue of the country that makes it great. And I think about that a lot now. What is it about America, but then also using America sort of as a heuristic for the West, these Western liberal democracies? What's the thing that makes it great? And it's this primacy of the individual over the rest and the respect for rights. We're seeing some of that challenged in the States by a confusion, I would say, on some people's part, between liberty and license, by kind of radical individualism. You can't ever tell me what to do ever. We need you to put into place these sort of public health measures. No, you can expletive right off. That is not in any sense, like for the founders, that's not liberty. Certainly isn't for the ancients.
Right.
There is a difference between liberty and selfishness.
Okay.
And that's true in all the texts across the board. The problem is where is that line?
The responsibility of a citizen.
Right. Because every right comes with a responsibility. There's always that dual relationship. We'll take up something that's not controversial. The Second Amendment to the Constitution, the right to bear arms. The first part of that clause is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the preservation of a free state. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. The duty, the responsibility, precedes the right. You have to serve in the militia to defend the country. Therefore, you have this.
Okay.
Our conversation
to defend the country. Sorry. So you have a gun? You have your arms? You bear your arms? For the country, correct?
Well, when you go into and you read the debates that are around this, some of it is, and this gets has been magnified in sort of right-wing circles for a long time, the fighting against the tyrannical government. Well, but the fight against a tyrannical government meant the fight against a government that was using the military to oppress its people. So what's the way of getting around having an oppressive military? You don't have one. Instead, you rely upon citizen militias. And that's all the topic, that's basically everything that's being discussed at this point at the end of the 19th century. You need to have an armed citizenry to be called up at a moment's notice to defend the country, instead of having a standing army ready to go to fight whatever. That context is not the context we discussed that amendment in today.
No.
All the major countries in the world, to a greater or lesser extent, have a standing army. The U.S. has a massive one. So the conversation is in some ways completely different than the one they were having.
Right.
But the principle, I think, is still there. If you're going to have a respect for rights, you also then have to have a respect for the responsibility that's inherent with them.
Okay.
And a lot of the conversations we're having today, I think, around COVID, the president frequently doesn't want to ever have that conversation. what are the obligations that come along with being a citizen of free society?
Okay.
Um, and I think where Hamilton points us out to sort of try to bring a loop
Yeah,
back
yeah.
on him, for a certain sense, what is the obligation that comes about it? You have to be willing to die for the country. He shows this time and time again. Well, what does that mean? Not just physically, it means you have to be willing to dedicate your life to it. That means your time, your private life. His private life is destroyed in a lot of ways because of his service to the country and his aspirations therein. That's not a healthy position for a liberal and a liberal democracy. And how do we know? The story tells us this. It kills him. His ambition destroys him. It's too much. It overwhelms him, and it takes his life.
So to be clear, we should not be willing to die for the country in the same way that he was?
It's to not see the Washington has a great line about this, that dying is easy, but living is harder.
Yes.
That the revolution is simple, but governing is harder. And that, yeah, like there's, how do you argue against this? But the difficulty that lies in a liberal society, as opposed to an illiberal one, an authoritarian, sort of a classical democracy even, and we can get into that in just a second. These decisions are not left to individuals to do for themselves. Instead, in a liberal society, this is sort of the problem that you also have with Christianity and all the variations that's in Christianity. How are you supposed to act on Tuesdays? What are you supposed to do? And in Islam or in Judaism, the other Abrahamic religions, that stuff's laid out for you. Christianity, it's way nebulous. There's a political scientist in the 80s, and this is a pretty long thing, but her name was Judith Sklar, and she wrote about this stuff really, really well. And she points out, and I think this is true, that liberalism is sort of a secular form of Christianity in a lot of ways.
Interesting.
It means it has the same problems. How are you supposed to spend your Tuesdays? What it does is it means we have to have a huge amount of public trust that the people in the society are going to be responsible for themselves and for their interactions with each other. And what I would say, to make this not be too dour, yeah, there's been a lot of examples, especially you can see it on the media everywhere, of people behaving irresponsibly, but a whole lot more that are being responsible, that are taking care of themselves and the people around them, making good decisions. And that gives me hope.
Okay.
And I know sometimes that gets hard to find, now, but it does, that you can have a system where you can trust people to make good decisions. Even if not all of them do, you can at least expect most of them to do it. And that gives me hope. And I think, Washington's character in that play lays this out. Hamilton's would, and that's the other interesting thing that I find about this. Hamilton's decent. This is the other thing that I take out of Aristotle. I think is really important. And if you want to get into it, we can get into it. That you have to think of these characters that you could be him, or you could be Eliza or whomever else in these. You can relate to them, and not just sort of a generic sort of oh gee whiz, this bad thing happened to this person. It has to be visceral. And, if you're a big fan of it, you know how visceral this musical is. And which means, Lin-Manuel Miranda is an outstandingly good job in making you imagine that you could be there, be these people, have these same struggles and these same hopes and ambitions. And that when the end comes, if it happened to you, you would say, I don't think that's fair. Not just because it is happening to me, but I don't think it's fair that it happened to him. And this is broadly what the word equity meant.
Okay, we're going there. Okay, so what can you explain further?
Yeah. So the Greek word on this is epiekes, and it means the decent. It means fair. It means equitable. Courts of equity, like equity is not a new thing. That word's been around for a long, long time. Like the British had courts of equity in their common law tradition, The job of this thing was to correct where the law is misapplied or when applying the law would actually be unjust.
Okay.
And the goal of equity is supposed to be, or at least in this sort of classical notion of it, is a way of fixing problems in the law in order to serve a greater understanding of justice. So equity is, in a certain sense, Aristotle puts it in this very confusing way. Um, it is like justice and better than justice. And you go, what in
Huh.
God's name does that mean?
Yes.
And he's not terribly clear, but the way that I've extrapolated or pulled this apart, the idea being that justice and the law are not the same thing. And liberals understand this. We understand this really well because we can see when, like, a legislature makes a law and we know it's wrong, or we've instantiated the idea even further. You have a constitution or a set of higher laws that govern lawmaking,
Mm-hmm.
and lawmaking can't violate those higher laws.
Mm.
That's, in a certain sense, in the spirit of equity, by saying there is a higher sense of justice that you have to serve. And I think when we talk, activists using that word, I think that's also the appeal. I'm not sure we understand what the nature of justice is. I'm not an expert on that stuff, so I'm going to make myself very cautious, and because I don't want to caricature people
Right.
that way. But in the ancient sense, equity is an action. It's not like a character. It's something that you constantly have to be doing, especially for someone like Aristotle. And
Do you have an
by
example
showing,
in the ancient world of equity? Can you give an example, like an act, something that did happen then that, and I don't know if that exists.
well, so I'll throw on my Aristotle hat and say we can even just use a hypothetical would work, where say if we do this in the law all the time, where we make exceptions for things. If you steal something because of malice, that's different than stealing something because you're hungry.
Intent.
Yeah, intent is essential, and
Okay.
like for an Aristotelian structure, ethics is what you do, but it's also why you do it. It's not like modern sort of Kantian ethics where intent is like the everything. What you do matters too for Aristotle, but you have to know why you're doing it. It's not enough just to do good things.
Right.
But well, we can get to that too because that's more. That's an interesting. It's an interesting problem.
Okay.
But to double back on the decency question, the equity question, the fairness one, we think of ourselves in that way. So says Aristotle. We think of ourselves as being fundamentally decent.
Yes.
At least people of good nature do. And we think of ourselves as being fair-minded.
Mm-hmm.
So we need these characters to be that way too.
Okay.
We have to see ourselves in them. And that's what arouses all the emotions and all the rest of it that comes from it. And where I think this musical is so perfect is it hitting on all of those beats of the things that we value in contemporary society, and the deep fissures that lie between those values. If you want to have ambition and be a public figure, it's going to require you sacrificing a lot of your private life. You're not really going to be able to have the quiet life that's happy, the stuff from to sit under your own vine and fig tree and no one will make you afraid.
Yeah, Washington sings that when he's talking about leaving the office.
Yeah, and for his farewell address. What that's talking about is the serenity that comes along with the private life. In the biblical texture, it's actually talking about sort of the end times and the utopia that's going to come at the end. So it's that shouldn't be lost on us when we're talking about that in terms of all of these guys. Their aspiration is to set up a society that is the best that the humans can live in. That's inspired by this sort of utopian vision. What does the perfect world look like? It's one where people are peaceful and they're not afraid of their neighbors and they can enjoy the fruits of their labor. And there's a serenity that comes along with this. That's not really the public life.
Right.
I think this is what's so interesting being off social media. It really highlights how much we've fused the chaos and cacophony of the private world into our public lives, in
Mm.
our pockets all the time, and it's driving us nuts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the public life is this sort of perpetual set of criticism. All you're ever going to do is people are always going to be coming after you. That's been true. That's just the nature of living in a free society with a public life.
Mm-hmm.
How much of your life should be spent on
Right.
it? And the Hamilton question sort of shows he's imbalanced in it. He
Mm.
sacrifices his private life, and look at all the things that it costs him. But who's the one that tells his story at the end? It's his wife.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the private life. And I think that also tells you some of the part of the American, the liberal nature of our character. What are the things we really value? It's
Mm-hmm.
the serenity of the private life. It's
Mm.
not the ambition of the public. That's old. That's how the Greeks thought or the Romans thought.
Mm.
Now modern liberals, that stuff leads to too much war. That leads to
Okay.
violence.
Well, that's how
Those
your name lives on, is when you're the hero in the war, right?
right. But well, sort of, maybe.
Maybe.
Um,
Okay.
well, no, but that's what I think that the musical sort of asking. Hamilton did these things in the war, and he did all this. He writes the Federalist Papers, and he's the first Secretary of Treasury, and he does all this kind of stuff. And yet, we don't really look to him as a person of reverence. Prior to the musical coming out in 2015, if people knew who he was the dude that was on the money.
Right.
And otherwise, that was sort of it.
Okay.
You'd have to get to somebody who's kind of bookish to know who he was.
You're
He certainly
right.
wasn't a cultural icon.
Okay,
Yeah,
I guess I was thinking of like Greek myths, and the ones who we remember are the ones who,
Yeah.
Mhm. Fought in the Trojan War type thing,
Yep.
or, defeated monsters in a fight. So that's, I guess, where I was going.
Yeah.
But you're right, for
Yep.
Hamilton, he did fight in the war, and he was a founding father, but wasn't really known culturally until the play.
Right. And yeah, and it sort of asks one of those really interesting meta questions: who gets to tell your story? It's not you.
Right.
It's the people that follow you.
Yeah.
And which is an interesting problem for all of us. No, but I think what you're highlighting there, this is something that drove Plato's Socrates kind of nuts. That we are revering all these people. Why are we revering? Why do we love Achilles so much? Like this guy goes, in the Iliad, when Patroclus is killed, or whatever, he goes absolutely just nuts. He stops being a human being and just butchers everybody.
Yeah.
This is what we want our people to be. This is sort of the aspiration. This is the stuff we're looking up to.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, there's an interpretation. I think that this could be persuasive. I'm not totally there, but it's an interesting one. Like Socrates is supposed to be the hero of the philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
To replace Achilles and Odysseus and the rest of these people, we could say in some sense that that's the role that Christ is supposed to play, or does play, certainly in Christianity, but broadly in Western society, at least in the way that it lives, if it's not the way that sort of people think or participate with the faith. Certainly in the value structure, it's sort of deeply entrenched. No, I think that's right. That you have this sort of reverence. But I always ask people this question, and this brings up a lot of, again, something else I shouldn't go too far into because I'll get in trouble. But these questions of like masculinity, what does it mean to be a man, this kind of stuff. And I always encourage people: what are the holidays in your society? A holiday is a holy day. Holy means to be made separate and distinct. So it's a day we've put aside for reverence and reflection. Who are the men that are being honored on these holidays? What were their characters, and what does it tell you about what you think your people should be? And in the U.S., you have Martin Luther King. I think this is what, in some ways, chaps people about Christopher Columbus, because
we don't want to be like that.
Well, he was revered as an explorer, but his character was garbage. So yeah, perhaps it is something that you should think about. But what's Christmas? Sort of the seminal holiday. What is the character of this man?
Mm.
And why is this person being given this elevated position?
Mm.
I think these are always questions that are certainly worth asking. Um,
Mm.
and I think that's in some ways what the play also encourages us to do.
Mm.
Um, who are these people? How should we aspire to be like them or not be like them? Again, Hamilton's a tragedy.
Mm.
This is not a thing where you go, everyone in the society should be like him. It's ruinous.
It's a
Like
cautionary tale.
he's destroyed, right? And unlike the other ones, like as they say, the other founding fathers get to grow old. Their stories get to be told often by them. John Adams lives to be in his 90s. Jefferson lives to be his early 80s, and Madison lives to be well into. I mean, he outlives both of them by far, by 20 years, and or 10 years, and these guys are household names in America, and I would say Jefferson even well beyond the borders of the country. What about them is worthy of reverence? We're having that debate about statues.
Right.
All these things are connected. It's not.
Well, okay. So why is Hamilton only now, of all of them, maybe save Washington? He's Hamilton. Even then, like he's like, against slavery. He's an immigrant himself. He has been poor.
Yep.
He has been through an insane amount of things, even as a young person. Lived through a hurricane, almost died of whatever disease. Like he's so admirable from what we know now because of the musical.
Because of the musical.
So why is it that he why did it take a musical for us to know him? Look, what does that say about us? What does that say about America that he isn't a household name of the founding fathers?
Yeah. So I think part of it is I'm not going to give you a satisfying answer to that second question because I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I think part of it is the Hamilton of the musical is not the Hamilton of history.
Okay.
That's the Hamilton, like the form of government that they allude to this in the musical. He goes to the Constitution Convention and proposes his own form of government. It was the president was going to serve for life, and so was the Senate.
So like a king.
It was, in essence, I mean, it wasn't great. They called him a monarchist.
Yeah.
Though I do think that this is interesting, and I want to come back to it, that both Hamilton and Madison end up writing these essays. I mean, John Jay's there too, but he putters out.
Yeah. I only wrote 5. He barely counts.
Both of them, Madison and Hamilton, proposed forms of government that are not the Constitution. And both of them have deep reservations about the nature of the Constitution when the convention ends.
Okay.
And yet, they're able to suspend those in order to pursue a higher good, which they think is the writing of this thing and the ratification of it. That skill set is something we could all benefit from. Learning how to separate what you think, I am sure this is the right form of government, but that's not the one that's going to work. This is the one that's going to work. How do I defend it? This ability to suspend your personal beliefs to defend something greater or more important than you. I think that's a remarkable quality that these guys had that we could all benefit a bit more from. The way to separate what's the mantra now? The personal is the political. It'd be better if those things were a little bit further apart. But to the other question, why does Hamilton's character, why does this thing all of a sudden pop back up? I think part of it is the musical is really good.
Yes. No question.
And I just, the premise of this thing is I'm going to write a Broadway musical that deconstructs musicals. And I'm going to use contemporary hip hop and rap influences. And I'm going to tell it about the guy who's on the money, who gets shot by the vice. And this is the other thing, like, he's the former treasury secretary that gets shot by the vice president. Like, these are not just dudes out in the street fighting each other. These are the highest echelons of power.
This is serious,
doing this stuff, right? This is nuts. And I want to write a musical about it. And then I'm going to win, 11 Tonys, and then go on and have this all kind of... You would have to have looked at Lin-Manuel and go, you are crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
right? How is this possibly going to work? I think some of it is that the culture has been waiting around, like floating around in hip hop and rap music for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that kind of music is going to speak to a much broader audience in 2015 than it would have in 1985.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you already get in that way. The music itself is brilliant. It's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly catchy. You can sing everything in that thing all day long. So it sticks with you. So in that way, it sort of serves its purpose. I think the other part of it is there's something in it that is so visceral. Um, we're on this quest for authenticity. We sort of have been since the emergence of the social media world, like YouTube in 2006 and all this kind of stuff. People want to be authentic, all the rest of this
And they
stuff.
want to know who they are, authentically
Right,
know who are we authentically.
right. Yeah, we're so desperate to be authentic that we've created these avatars online so everybody can think they see who we are, and it's like, guys, come on, this whole thing's a canard. But
Yeah.
what the musical does is it strips off the veneer and makes you feel this stuff.
Uh-huh.
And I also think there's a certain amount of sense in the culture, and again in America, but then more broadly, tragedies are really powerful, and they have been for 2,600 years.
Okay, putting a pin in that you mentioned that we don't like tragedies.
Yeah.
So I was gonna ask that again. So if we're covering that, that ticks that box off. Because I was like, why don't we like tragedies?
Because they bum us out.
But people have been writing tragedies for millennia because of
Yep.
there's something there.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. But the
They
thing
bum
that
us
sort of
out. Okay.
well, so like the emergence of tragedy again in Aristotle's sort of telling, which their modern scholarship sort of argues with him a little bit on this, but there's a lot of it's really kind of nebulous because there's not a lot of documents. Tragedy emerges out of the religious practice of the time, the retelling of Homer, and then instead of telling Homer, people started acting out Homer, and then they started writing the stories, and it sort of evolved into that.
Mm-hmm.
Comedy, excuse me, let me back that up. Those things sort of emerged before democracy in Athens, or at least sort of preceded by a little bit. Comedy, as we know it, Aristophanes, sort of the great comedian of the time, emerges with democracy, and it comes out of ridicule. And democratic really like to make fun of people. Like we really enjoy, and especially. So let me put another qualifier on this. When I'm talking about democracy here, I don't mean it in the contemporary sort of colloquial sense where we mean not authoritarian government when it's everything else. I mean democracy as rule of the majority.
Okay.
And in the ancient world, and I mean, they understood this, and anything is true. The majority is always the poor people. There's always more poor people in a country than anything else. So. And everybody sort of knows this viscerally. You don't need to read these books to know it. What do poor people hate the most? It's that they're poor.
The elites. Oh.
And right. So what do they disdain? They hate the wealthy.
Yeah. And
so what does that cultivate? What emotion does that cultivate in them? Envy and resentment. And so where does sort of comedy comes from? It comes from tapping into that resentment, but
it's a little bit of a release in like in an appropriate way.
Yeah. Well, it's catharsis, right?
Yes.
And in a certain sense, comedy is tapping into that. The German word on this is Schadenfreude, right?
I've heard that word before, but I don't remember what it means. So
well, and it's the German version of the Greek epikareikakia, which is a joy out of pain. Literally, that's what the word means.
Tragedy plus time equals comedy.
Well, that's what people say.
Okay, maybe that isn't applied. Okay, maybe that. Okay.
Well, no, I mean, maybe. But here, what it really means, it's the sense of when there's someone you don't like and you watch them fall down the stairs, you laugh at them.
Yeah.
Now, if it's someone you like and you watch them fall down the stairs, it's panic-inducing.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's the same event. Again, it comes back to that question of intention, and it's the emotion that you're trying to arouse.
Okay.
Tragedy arouses emotions of the Greek is aleos, which gets translated as pity. I think that's a bad word for us because we use pity in a very nebulous way. I think it's far closer to our word empathy. Imagining the suffering of what it would be like to be this person. It's an other relating painful emotion. Comedy doesn't really do that. It's not designed to make us relate to them. It's really designed to make us go, look at this so-and-so, right? What an idiot.
What's the deal with so-and-so? Yeah.
Right.
Seinfeld,
it sets us up for ridicule and to lambast and this kind of stuff. Democracies love comedy. Aristotle did this. And
that's why we don't like tragedies anymore, because we're like, oh, comedy, yes, please.
Or that's my argument.
Yeah.
I think there's a Howard Bloom makes this argument. I think he's an English professor, and Paul Cantor. He's really good on this stuff. If you guys want to read books, Paul Cantor is excellent on this. Where he talks about what is the sort of the American contribution to aesthetics or storytelling. It's the romantic comedy. It's the rom-com. And in other ways, it's the sitcom, the situation comedy. We love this stuff because at the end, everything gets wrapped up in a neat little bow, and it's all aspirational and it's sort of feel good, and it kind of speaks to the character of a people who never really think that bad things are coming in the future. Okay,
so this is where it's coming back to bite us, and why tragedy is important. Is this where you're going?
Yep. Yeah. You almost took the words out of it.
I'm so sorry. Please.
No, it's good. No, it's good. It means my logic's not crazy. If you can come along the ride, that's good.
Okay.
But I think there is a certain amount of sense of anyone who's around someone that's too perky for too long knows that you go, okay, enough.
Yeah.
And
I know, Stephen. I know. I'm the one who's too perky.
And but then on the other side, our threshold for that, I think, at least maybe pronounced of late, we get really tired of dour people.
Okay.
Right. But there's still a sense of especially living in a time of tumult, which I think is certainly now. Like we haven't seen this in the global culture since 1968. And what does it look like going forward? We don't know.
Okay.
And I think about that year as a good one. That year ended with, and I'm sure someone will correct me on this, I'm pretty sure it's Apollo 8. They send a person in a capsule and they go around the moon. And the picture of Earth rising above the moon comes from that trip.
Okay.
And it's sort of the first time this happens. That's at the end of the year that's been the most tumultuous of at least since the end of the Second World War, but culturally, I mean, probably in centuries. The sort of the way people think about themselves and go about it. It ends on this very high aspirational, things are going to get better in the future. Look at what our reason can accomplish, and we collectively get together. We're not going to have, I mean, I hope history proves me to be a fool. I don't see that happening at the end of this year. We don't have the aspiration. There's not an Apollo level mission going on that we have SpaceX and this kind of stuff, but that's all privatized. That's not collective venture. So where I think that there's a sense in this era, I'm not sure people know or think anyway that tomorrow will be better than yesterday. And like Steven Pinker's been out there beating this drum for a while. Like, yes, it is, guys. Come on, look at the data. Read my big freaking book. Right?
Yeah.
Attention. And I think this is also really useful to think about. Like, I think history serves two purposes, or at least has two functions, at least two. But for my purposes, there are two. There's history as scientific history. This is what happened.
Yes.
And then there's history of how we see ourselves through the myths in history.
Okay.
Sort of the what's the narratives, narratives we use, and factually, I think Pinker makes a pretty compelling argument in most of his things. I'm not sure in all of them, but
Like world poverty, right? It's
Yeah,
yeah.
sure. There's almost no question that things are getting better. And I think the easiest example of this, and people were doing this stuff at the end of the 19th century. Andrew Carnegie makes this argument. Um, you would much rather be poor now than wealthy in 1400.
Mm.
Hell, you would rather be poor now than be wealthy in 1900.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Things are getting better.
But
There's a really hard belief in getting people to feel it or to notice it, to recognize it. And some people, this is particularly, with conservatives, like to go, oh, it's all these entitled little bastards and all this kind of stuff, and they suck and all this kind of stuff, blah, blah, blah. And then there's the other ones, sort of, I guess we could call them progressives, or they call themselves this, like, no, everything's actually garbage.
Yeah.
All the systems are based on oppression, and all you've got to tear it all down, and all the rest of this kind of stuff. Those, in some ways, are flip sides of the same coin.
Uh-huh.
Everything sucks. Yeah, you're right, but for the opposite reason.
Yeah.
Where in reality, and I think this is sort of certainly where Pinker falls on this kind of stuff, everything is getting better. But as things are getting better, the dangers to losing it all also increases.
Mm-hmm.
It is way more difficult to be a person in 2020 than it was in 1920.
You didn't really question, you just lived your life from day to day, right?
And you were, like, again, the founding is a really good example of this. They are just railing against tyrannical government. I can't stand this. This is terrible. I use this example with my students all the time. And you have to forgive me. I've never actually been to Canada. I have to make my way up there.
That's okay. I forgive you. You're pardoned.
I use this example, like the shape of a toilet seat at home is an oval here, right? In public, the shapes of the toilets are open in the front. And why do we do that? Is it, because they were skimping out on the plastic? No,
I thought it was just sanitary.
It's public health regulation.
Yeah.
Right? We regulate how people use the bathroom. And as opposed to the founding era, when they're screaming about tyranny, your interaction with the federal government at that point was like once every week or two when they delivered your mail.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these are different scales in the way we understand this stuff. That complexity has brought about a whole lot of anxiety and depression, and I think Durkheim is the one that calls this anomie, a feeling of lostness. I don't feel where I'm at. I'm sort of floating along in this. And that sort of exacerbates all of these tensions and these problems. But it makes the artistic landscape rife for tragedies.
I was just, Stephen, I was like, are tragedies the answer? Like, I was going to ask that, but then you just said this. So please, yes. Yeah, I'm trying to work out where they fit.
I think in some ways, I'm not sure if anything ever gives answers so much as I think what it does is there's an appetite for it.
Okay.
And there's particularly an appetite for it on really high levels. I mean, we've had dramas for a long time. It's not like this is new. Dramas are part of it. I'm not sure all dramas are tragedies, but we've had that sort of suspense and these very serious, somber kind of stuff. Yeah, and that certainly is part of it. I mean, like the Oscars, that's the most important award. And so, that they're certainly a part of it, and there's a recognition of it. And they're popular well enough. They're not as popular as like superhero movies, or even like James Bond movies, and these sort of action adventure sort of things. But tragedy is sort of a genre or a way of storytelling. I think, to me anyway, why I think it continues to have resonance. Like, I just read several of them the other day. I read Iphigenia and Oedipus, and these kinds of the Greek ones, and they still have resonance, even though I'm not praying to Zeus. This kind of stuff is going on, but there's something about it that speaks to the limitations of the human condition, the limitations of reason, the desire to control things in a world where you can't always control things. But tragedy, at least again, I think from an Aristotelian perspective, tells us stories about our undoing or our destruction, but they're not random. like Hamilton doesn't die because a building falls on him, or something else. Instead, his undoing is because of the confrontation he proliferates with an opponent
Mm-hmm.
that escalates because of their mutual ambition.
Mm-hmm.
His mistake in this, is sort of his undoing is not because of something that sort of happens to him. It's part of him.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that story wouldn't be effective if you didn't see his ambition bring him all kinds of accolades earlier, and so him being
Right.
incredibly successful. Like
Mm-hmm.
the whole front half of that play is like it's electrifying because you're going, yeah, it really speaks to that drive that especially young people have. I'm going to change the world. I'm going to go out and do this stuff,
And he does.
and he does,
He
right?
does
That's
it.
incredibly successful, and he also is surrounded by a bunch of other young people who are also incredibly successful in their ambition. The person who isn't is Eliza. Um, you know, wouldn't this be enough? That's not a song about ambition.
No.
Um,
It's about the
and
private life, like you're talking
exactly,
about. And
that's
what
exactly.
okay, what is it compelling about the private life? To me, it seems like the relationships. The relationships with others, community. It's
Yeah,
small, but it's meaningful.
I think Tocqueville is helpful on this in the way he frames it. He says it's sweet, it tastes good, um, and who wouldn't want it? It's warm and inviting. Like he uses the comparison between old. He calls them European, but aristocratic families. Game of Thrones, good
Mm-hmm.
example. What do those characters want? They want especially the sons. What do they want? They want their dads to die because they want to be in charge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, these are people of incredible ambition to the point where even their private life is sort of succumbs to it. It's cold, it's calculated, and the thing that's the most important about you is your last name, carrying on the name of the family and the banner. Democratic families, sort of modern contemporary, we don't have any use for this crap, right? Like we have deep affection for the loss of a parent is some of the most tragic things a person can go through, right? It's not something we go, yeah, I get my inheritance and now I'm in charge of everything. Instead, it's warm and there's affection there, and parents aren't just grooming their children to replace them. There's a sense of like I'm trying to improve you, and and this kind of it's sweet. He says, even to someone, I find this very persuasive, even to someone who grew up in an aristocratic family, they want their family to be democratic, liberal in this sense, because it's warm and it's inviting and it's comfortable. Who doesn't want this stuff? And it gives another one of the words people talk about today. You're seen, right? There's a place, right?
Yes.
There's
You're
this
seen
sense
and you're heard.
Yeah, in the family, that's what you're supposed to be, and again, this is sort of that conflict between the private is the public and the public is the private. What's personal is political. There's a collapse into this stuff, and it's not terribly surprising that that's the language of like, not just inclusivity, but dramatic inclusivity, like familial inclusivity, that's supposed to be applied to the entire society. I We'll get to that, but there's a deep appeal, and you see why, because that's what you want in your life. And if liberalism is about anything, it's about taking for you what you want for someone else. Like Locke talks about this stuff, like you go out into nature and you get the food that you can eat, but you shouldn't take so much that the person next to you starves. One, because it's the wrong thing to do. Two, and this is sort of a reading into Locke a bit, but it's in there implicitly. You don't want them to do that to you, right? There's a kind of a recognition of reciprocity, and when you build that stuff into the family, as it is sort of by nature, who wouldn't want it?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah, but then even go more extensively and say, my neighbor is my brother. Right?
Oh man, I love that, Stephen.
But there are dangers to that.
Okay.
and like, um, we'll go down this. We'll go down this.
Okay, Stephen, you're like, we'll do this. Okay, we'll do that. We'll do that. I only
Yeah.
have so much time for this one talk. So wait,
Yeah,
so can we
no,
go
no.
there? Can we
Yeah,
go there
yeah.
now?
I promise I'll bring it all back together.
Oh, okay,
Um,
okay.
so the sort of the Christian political tradition that exists. I'm going to use a Puritan, John Winthrop,
Okay.
and his sort of most famous speech on this. He ends up concluding or arguing that, and this is very much in line with the old tradition, that politics requires love. And the word that he uses, Latin's caritas, it's the same in Greek. Our word charity comes from it.
Oh.
The title of the speech is a Christian charity, a model of Christian charity, and it's what this new society, a shining city upon a hill, calling from the Book of Revelations, and America comes to see itself in this way. This kind of stuff. A society is supposed to be based on love, but it's not some sort of like stupid love. It's the kind that, let's say, Martin Luther King talks about. Creative suffering together, enduring hardship, struggling toward justice together.
My neighbor is my brother. Yeah.
Right. And that's what politics is about. The problem, 2 generations after John Winthrop, is the Salem witch trials. So when you have a society that's so much dedicated to love and the improvement of others around you, what does it lead to? It leads to these kinds of internal arguments of purification, and where you dedicate, I love you so much that I'll drown. This kind of stuff.
Okay.
And this is where I'll bow tie it back in. This is why liberalism stands in so much opposition to that stuff. Liberalism isn't about teaching people to love each other. It teaches people to tolerate each other, and it's a much more mild form. Far more mild form.
Sustainable.
Well, it shouldn't lead to people being stoned for being witches, or people want to make the allegory today of being canceled by the mob. I think getting stoned as a witch is probably worse than being canceled online.
Yes, it is. Although some people have committed suicide as a result of the stoning of the mob, but yes.
And all these things are always tragic, but certainly. And
but in general, it's not the mob literally heaving stones at you. Yeah.
Well, but what it does, drawing on the metaphor, what it does is it shows how moderate we've become in our expectations. Public executions are not tolerable. And there's a reaction to even the cancel culture and the online mobs and this kind of stuff. We don't like this stuff because it smacks up against those sentiments of toleration, those deeply embedded characters of liberalism.
But Stephen, I have always been the proponent of like love is better than hate.
Yeah, sure.
Love your brother, love your neighbor as your brother. Like those are the types of things that Dr. King spoke about.
Sure.
That in these tense times, I would look at that sermon by John Winthrop, and I would say yes, this. But then you like undid it with the witch trials. And I am a little bit having some dissonance here with understanding, but love is better.
Yeah.
So I don't understand.
Yeah, no, it's one of those. Is it
because people are flawed? Is that why?
Well, it's actually one of the real. Okay. So I have the prejudice of being born in America. So I have patriotism because of being born in the country, and I hope everyone who's listening, that's also whatever country you're born in, you have patriotism for your country. I also find the intellectual tradition of America fascinating for this contradiction, because there is a dual sense of needing to have charity for your neighbor, this sense that love is so important, with the limitation of toleration. And those two things are constantly in conflict.
Okay.
How much do my neighbors need to look like me or be like me for me to love them? And our modern answer is sort of like, well, they don't need to have anything. You just love them as human beings.
Yes.
But that only takes about 5 seconds to push on to go, that's not true. We know that's not, people don't, you're not going, like, say, for example, the hanging of gay men in Iran. You don't go, well, we love you for this. No, that's a hard stop.
Uh-huh.
Um, there is, you can love people who are like you that believe in human rights. You
Mm,
can love
mm.
people who are like you that are fundamentally liberal in their character. Because love there really is a euphemism for a kind of enhanced toleration.
I
It's
see.
not it's not the love of um, your soul will be damned forever, so I have to save you. That sort of need to go out and make sure that someone isn't just similar to you enough to tolerate them, but like you enough to where you can quite literally worship with them, live with them, marry, these kinds of things, share your
Oh.
private life, die with
Okay,
them.
okay. I'm seeing the puritanical gatekeeping coming out in the love.
Yeah, yeah, and it's one of those problems that's sort of part and parcel, because when you then turn to the opposite side, which would be a society that's just based on toleration,
Okay.
where there isn't a sense of affection, that's a society that's just based on contracts.
Yeah.
I just won't hurt you, and this is a society that is vacuous and empty, and I think sort of perfectly is a model of the caricature of like people on the lefts of contemporary society. It's just all corporatism, it's all racism, it's all this kind of stuff. It's just hollow, and it's just based on quid pro quos.
Right.
It's very, very empty.
So it's a balance or a tension.
It's a deep tension, I think.
Mm.
And there are periods where you can see it sort of awesome. I think liberalism has this problem in it too, just to a lesser degree than the sort of the American specific question does. And it may be true in other cultures too. I can't be an expert in everything.
No, you
So
can't.
if there are if there are other ones, I hope I discover them, because I find this a fascinating problem.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, how do you deal with this tension? Um, and I think this is where, to double back again on the very first thing we talked about, that's sort of the burden of being a citizen in a liberal society. Um, how do you navigate the tension of, toleration is a really ugly thing. It just means I won't hurt you.
Mm.
I don't have to shop where you shop. I don't have to do any of this kind of stuff. There, you don't live together in a certain sense. It's just, we just won't hurt each other.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a certain amount of public willingness to put up with things that you disdain.
Mm.
Uh, that's pretty
Low
the
bar?
yeah. One of the people who's had a deep influence on me is Leo Strauss. He's a political philosopher in the 20th century. He refers to it as low but firm ground.
Oh.
People can agree on this stuff, and it's
Mm-hmm.
pretty steady, it's pretty solid, but it's pretty empty.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and how do you get people to go to war and die for that?
Mm.
It's hard. So you have to have something else that sort of cultivates that. And I think this is where all these conversations about narratives are so important. How do you construct a sense of we? And I think this is where the Hamilton piece again ties all back in, sort of around it. It's fundamentally asking this question. America has long thought of itself in sort of the lens of Jefferson, Washington. These are the household names. People even refer to the American system as Madisonian, like it's there
Mm.
all the time. And this thing is going, no, it's a country of immigrants. And it's a
Mm.
country of immigrants based on ambition.
Mm.
The problem is when that ambition is greater than they can control.
Mm.
And that's the sort of the allegory for the American experience altogether. Um, Again, he ends in tragedy because he goes further than he can. The
Mm-hmm.
honor of for himself and his name takes him further than he can handle, and it kills him. Um, that's the problem of being the duty in a liberal society. What do you do with your ambition, and do you direct it into your private life, so into making money, right? Which is how we mostly deal with our ambitious people today.
Uh-huh.
They don't become emperors; they
Right.
become CEOs,
Yes.
and for the most part, that works out, because you're always going to have people of ambition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, so what do you do with them? And
Mm.
the liberal society is to direct it into the private life. The problem with the private life is it's not really sort of hospitable to ambition. It doesn't really like it, as that play displays so well.
Yeah.
Let this be enough. Just stay here, stay home, raise the kids, be with me.
But but it's a, I would say balance, but I know you like tension.
Yeah.
It's both. It has to be both. And that's what we are struggling as a society to figure out where to exist and what plane to exist, public and private, right?
Yeah, I think
And
so.
what do we all look up towards?
Right. Well, and that's been the big. I mean, that's been the big debates and these culture wars. We're just sort of in the second round of the culture wars. This stuff started in the late '80s,
Mm.
and sort of reached a peak and then sort of goes down a little while during 9/11, and then it sort of burst back onto the scene in the latter part of the last decade. But it's gotten better. It's
Uh-huh.
not good, but it's better. But I think that has a whole lot more to do with the fact that uh, John McWhorter, the linguist, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah, I've seen him, yeah.
um, he talks about, and I think this is exactly right, the mainstreaming of so-called black culture, rap
Mm-hmm.
music, hip hop, this kind of stuff. Um, the way that has disseminated, and the way that African American vernacular has mainstreamed,
Mm-hmm.
is going to have so much more of an impact on the way people think in terms of racial lines and the way that
Oh,
they
okay.
understand each other. That's going to have immense effects.
Like in a positive way?
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
tremendously.
Okay, I'm like, I think that's where you're going. I just wanted to double check. Yes, yes.
But this is what's so important again to sort of come back to the main thoroughfare.
Mm-hmm.
This is the really big important to the stuff that you watch and the stuff
Mm.
that you listen to, and
Watch
artists.
Hamilton. Watch Hamilton, everyone. So
Right,
artists, yes, artists. Let's
but
let's
but
end on that note. Yeah.
so artists really seem to understand, in a certain sense, the power that comes with that. And so you see a lot of them doing a lot of these sort of public displays of whatever the hell it is they're doing on this stuff. And it's like, guys, it's not you. We don't care about you. What's important is the stories that you're telling.
Mm.
It's being able to get someone in the audience to buy into the thing that you're saying, not into you,
Mm.
right? Like you are a PR, you are a thing to sell products. What's really interesting or what's really compelling is the thing inside of it.
Mm.
And the more and more, again, Hamilton's really good because it flips over a lot of these racial questions. Can you get someone who is Latino or African American to play someone who traditionally wasn't, and those kind of stuff? And what it does is it completely dissolves the need for the idea that one has to be literal in their representation. We
Mm-hmm.
know
Mm-hmm.
um, we didn't need Hamilton for that. People, E.T. showed us this kind of stuff. You can get emotional about all kinds of stuff. Um, but what it does do, sort of in this broad public sense, at least I think so anyway, is it gives us the opportunity to think beyond the narrow scope of what the law says for us or lays out for what life should be. And instead, what it does is it gives us an insight into what our life isn't. And I think that's what art always sort of does. It's about expanding perspective
Mm.
um, and giving you the opportunity to think in a way that you wouldn't otherwise.
Mm.
Uh, and we're so saturated with it now that we don't ever really pay attention to how remarkable it is. Like that idea of being a fish in the stream and not knowing what water is. Um, we live in a time that no one else ever had. This is nuts. That you have a soundtrack to your life now. Music used to be an event. Like
Mm.
you went and did music like 2 or 3 times a year,
Mm.
and now we get 30 seconds into a song and get bored, you know, and next or whatever. You have hours and hours, days of music and movies, and it's nonstop.
Mm.
But what's it doing? It's softening a lot of these prejudices and these
Mm.
biases.
Mm.
It's not. I'm not sure it's doing it as rapidly as we want. I would say it's not doing it as rapidly as we want.
But it's there.
There's too much still of seeing things along these divisional lines instead of a sort of a hierarchy. Instead of seeing again the example of deaths in say Chicago. Who's that a problem for? It's a problem for everyone that lives in that city. Why? Because they're all citizens in that city.
Mm.
And
This is ancient, isn't this? This is like city-state thinking, right?
This is
Like what you're describing.
It's a more active notion of what it means to be a citizen
Okay.
than liberalism really tends to.
Okay.
It's a notion that a citizen is responsible for the preservation of the society and for making it a society worth preserving.
Right.
And where sort of the thinner liberal notion is, we're going to preserve this stuff so long as it's in my benefit.
Okay.
That's subsumed in the first one, right? Because it's going to be to your benefit to live in somewhere that's worth living in. But it's also meaning that you're going to want to do that for the people around you. Now, obviously, these are ideals. The ancient world was not all that different from us, full of all kinds of garbage and all the, inequities and injustice and all that kind of stuff.
Of course, yeah.
That's just part of being human. But it does ask us to think about this in a little more visceral way, a more difficult one, always with the caveat of this deep tension, this problem that, again, I think is exemplified so well by Hamilton. How do you deal with a liberal people that are full of ambition? And what could be their ultimate end? Is it Jefferson getting to retire to his mountain, writing essays to his, to John Adams where they debate philosophy? Yeah. Or is it Hamilton being shot on a cliff in New Jersey?
But Eliza is the one who, she lives another 50 years and she establishes the wonderful orphanage where she takes care of orphans. And I honestly think that, maybe I'm tapping into the feminine side of where we should be going, but that seems like the ultimate ideal for me.
But what's so interesting about that is it's a completely non-political one.
Yes, absolutely it is.
It's a completely personal, devoid of. She does things that have public importance, but she's not in the public realm. She's not, an elected official in this kind of stuff.
So those who do want to be in the public realm, that with ambition and whatnot.
But the problem it really raises is for a democratic society where every interaction with someone else is in the public sphere, so to speak. You can't really have those clean lines of public and private, especially in a liberal democracy. How do you handle that problem? And again, this is why there's not an answer. It's an open question.
But the art that we've been discussing, Hamilton, and there's other. It doesn't just have to be a musical, but this is what was prudent for us. But it does ask you. It shows you the avenues that could happen, and it makes you think.
I think the biggest thing it has the power to do, and we didn't even get into too much of this, which is too bad. We'll have to do this again, hopefully not in a year.
Yes, but, I know it was a year, but yeah, absolutely, please come back on. Yes,
to get it back, it can help us expand the people we think that are like us. And the more you're able to expand those people who you think are like you, the more you see when injustice happens to them, it's as if it happened to you. There's certainly a limit, but I think that the art can help expand that. And it has huge political ramifications.
My neighbor is my brother.
I'll put it this way. I am in the category of having all of the privileges, right? If all the way down. Except for I'm the first one in my family to go to college. Actually, I'm the first one in my family to graduate from high school. That's my only sort of thing.
Okay.
My sister is gay, and my brother is married to someone who's African American. So I got some of that stuff. But for me, I tick off the boxes.
Okay.
I think what the expansion of like us should mean is everything that every opportunity that I have, projected or real, you should have too. And I think that should be the extent of what like us means.
Okay.
That I should be the default setting, not the privileged one.
Oh, I love it. Oh, good place to end. Good place to end, Stephen. Thank you so much for this chat.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too rambling.
No, it was great. And I had to hold back from singing the Hamilton songs, so I achieved that, so.